She was a mother in a wheelchair, abandoned with her twin daughters at a gas station. He was a quiet single dad, just passing through with no reason to stop. So why did he pull over that day? And what secret was this woman hiding one so big it could change the fate of an entire fortune? This isn't a love story in the traditional sense. It's a story about resilience, about how a broken garden can still bloom, about a girl whose biological father was a billionaire, but whose real family came from a small farm, a rusted truck, and a man with dirt on his hands and kindness in his eyes. What makes someone a parent? What happens when the truth comes knocking in the form of a lawyer, with a gold-sealed letter, and when the courts come for your child? How far would you go to keep love from being taken? Hit like, tap subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances, because what you're about to hear might just change how you define family forever. Let's begin. The wheels of the old suitcase didn't roll well on gravel, but Ellery Voss didn't complain. She gripped the sides of her wheelchair tightly, hands raw from pushing, while her twin daughters Nora and Lila clung to the sleeves of her oversized coat. The wind along the stretch of Alder Creek Road kicked dust into their faces, tugging strands of hair from beneath her scarf. Behind them, the forest was silent. Ahead of them, the man who left them behind was already gone. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't needed to. Just one sentence. "You made your choices, Ellery. You live with them now." Then he'd shut the trunk, dropped their bag, and driven off. Ellery didn't cry. She hadn't cried in front of the girls in months, but Lila had, silently. Her face pressed into Ellery's side like she could disappear there. Nora hadn't said a word since. The sky was beginning to darken when the truck pulled off the road and slowed. A dusty, dented blue Chevy. Maybe late 90s, the kind of truck that had seen better decades. It idled for a beat. Then the engine cut. Silence. The driver stepped out slowly, hands visible, like approaching a wild animal. He looked to be in his late 30s. Work-worn jeans, dark flannel, broad shoulders that said he knew hard labor, and eyes that said he knew hard days. "Evenin'," he said gently, voice like smooth gravel. "Y'all okay?" Ellery tensed. She didn't answer, not right away. Her instinct screamed not to trust anyone, not anymore. But then Nora's small hand trembled in hers, and the man didn't come closer. "My name's Silas," he added. "Silas Trent. I live about 15 miles from here. Got a house, heat, supper on the stove. Not trying to scare you. Just figured you might need somewhere to breathe." Ellery's voice cracked before it even formed. "We're fine." But they weren't, and he knew it. He looked down at the suitcase. One wheel was broken, dragging sideways like a stubborn shopping cart. A cardboard sign was jammed between it and a backpack. "Please, just warmth for one night." Silas didn't ask questions. He just tilted his head toward the truck. "It's warm? I've got a kid at home. He's quiet. Likes books. Keeps to himself. But he's kind." He paused. "I'm not going to touch your story. But if you're tired of being told no, this is a yes." Ellery swallowed. The ache in her arms burned. Her legs, useless since the accident, had long since gone numb in the cold. She looked down at her daughters. Lila was watching the man, eyes narrowed like she was trying to decide if he was a ghost. Nora was curled into herself, rabbit plushie clutched like a lifeline, and in that moment cold, aching, half-broken, Ellery nodded. One time, the ride was quiet. Silas didn't try to fill the space. He just turned up the heat and turned down the radio. The girls sat in the back seat, wrapped in an old flannel hunting blanket. Nora dozed off with her head on Lila's shoulder. Ellery sat beside Silas, posture tight, like a coiled spring. Outside, the Oregon trees rushed past like dark watercolor. "You're a long way from anywhere," Silas said softly. She didn't reply. He glanced at her. Respectful. "I won't push." After a while, she spoke. "He was my father." Silas nodded once, like he'd already guessed. He said I needed to learn independence. Silas gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. The house was old, but neat. A white-painted porch, a squeaky swing, lights already glowing warm behind faded curtains. Cassian stood on the steps, Silas's teenage son, hood up, book in hand, frozen mid-page when he saw them. Silas gave a quick nod. "We've got company." Cassian blinked, then turned and disappeared inside. Silas wheeled Ellery up the ramp himself. She hated it, but she was too tired to argue. Inside, the smell of chili and cornbread hit like a memory of something good. Cassian returned with a pile of folded blankets and set them on the couch. He didn't say much, just gave a small nod to the girls, then disappeared again. Ellery looked around the living room. Photos on the wall, a stack of books, a frayed quilt on the rocking chair. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like someone had built this place with care. Like maybe it had healed them, too. Later that night, when the girls were asleep on makeshift cots and the fire had burned low, Silas brought her a cup of tea. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Everyone deserves a place to land, even if just for a night." She stared into the cup. "I forgot what warm feels like." Silas sat across from her. "Then maybe it's time to remember." And in the stillness, beneath the hum of the heater and the breath of sleeping children, something inside her uncoiled. Not fully, not yet, but it stirred. The next morning, the porch swing creaked under the slow rhythm of wind and old memory, the kind of sound that made you pause without realizing why. Inside the Trent house, sunlight spilled across the wooden floors, dust rising like tiny fireflies. In the kitchen, the clatter of a skillet and the faint scent of butter filled the air. Ellery Voss stirred beneath a thick wool blanket. Her shoulders were stiff. Her back ached from the unfamiliar cot. But what woke her wasn't pain. It was laughter. Childish. Sudden. Real. She pushed herself upright, her wheelchair catching slightly on the edge of the worn rug. She followed the sound to the kitchen. There, at a wooden table weathered by years of cereal spills and homework scribbles, sat her daughters. Nora was already mid-giggle, maple syrup smeared across her chin. Lila was quieter, but her lips curled up at the corners as she watched Cassian attempt to flip a pancake without burning the bottom. Silas stood at the stove, flipping the next one like a pro, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Morning," he said when he saw her in the doorway. Not surprised, not awkward, just morning, like it was normal. Ellery hesitated. This wasn't their kitchen. These weren't their people. But no one looked at her like she didn't belong. "You okay with buttermilk?" Silas asked, holding up the spatula. Yes." Her voice came out thinner than she meant. "You get the tiebreaker vote," Cassian said, holding up 2 pancakes. "One of them tastes like actual food. The other, according to Nora, is a hot sponge in disguise." Nora giggled again. "It's true." Ellery rolled further in, uncertain where to put herself. She caught Lila's eye and paused. Her daughter was drawing on a napkin. A little house, a garden, a figure in a chair next to 2 small girls, and behind them, tall and broad, someone that looked suspiciously like Silas. Ellery's throat tightened. When had her daughter learned to see strangers as safety? Later that morning, Silas walked her down the ramp and around the side of the house. The wheels of her chair caught once on a root, but he was beside her before she asked. "Mind the curve," he said. "Rain washed some of the gravel out last week." They stopped near a fenced patch of land behind the barn. The garden. It had once been neat. There were still faint rows in the dirt, but time and weeds had reclaimed it. Dead vines clung to the fence like regrets that wouldn't let go. Silas stood quietly, hands in his jacket pockets. "This was my wife's," he said. Ellery didn't speak. She knew grief when it hung in the air. Marla, she passed 5 years ago. Breast cancer. He looked down at his boots. She loved this space. Tomatoes, sunflowers, a little row of herbs she'd always forget to water. Ellery wheeled forward, fingers brushing against the rusted chicken wire. "Would you mind," she said slowly, "if I tried to fix it?" Silas looked at her, not with pity, not with disbelief, just looked. "You want a garden?" She nodded. "I can't do much, but I can dig." He gave a small, quiet smile. "Then it's yours." That afternoon, Nora and Lila helped clear the first row. Well, Nora helped. Lila directed, serious and focused, pulling weeds like they owed her an apology. Cassian stood nearby, pretending not to watch, a book half open in his hand. Every now and then, when one of the girls shrieked about a worm, he came over to identify the creature with dry teenage precision. "It's a red wriggler," he'd mumble. "Good for soil. They don't even have teeth." Ellery sat near the edge of the patch, gloved hands in the dirt. The scent of earth filled her lungs. It didn't feel like brokenness. It felt like possibility. That evening, when the sky blushed pink and the air turned to chill, Ellery sat on the porch swing. The girls were inside with Cassian, playing some kind of card game involving animal sounds and poorly disguised cheating. Silas joined her, holding 2 mugs of peppermint tea. "You're good with them," Ellery said quietly. "I don't know about good," Silas answered, "but I try to be steady. Sometimes that's enough." She sipped her tea. "Steady's more than most." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't empty. It held something. Gratitude. Maybe trust. Maybe just the comfort of 2 people who understood what it meant to lose something and still choose to give. Silas reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded photo. It was worn, the edges soft. "Marla," he said. "The garden used to bloom all the way to the back fence." Ellery took the photo carefully. A woman in her 30s, wind-blown hair, smile like sunlight. "She looks brave." "She was fierce, too." He chuckled, could fix a carburetor and quote Maya Angelou in the same breath. "She would have liked you," he added softly. Ellery looked down. No one had said something like that to her in a long time. That night, long after the girls had fallen asleep in Cassian's room, twin sleeping bags tucked side by side, and the fire had turned to soft embers, Ellery wheeled herself back to the sunroom. The window was open slightly. The wind whispered through the screen. She opened a small notebook she hadn't touched in years. The pen felt strange in her hand. But the words came. Some homes are not built with blueprints. Some are grown between broken fences, between hot pancakes and shared silence. And some are found by accident. But they stay, and they bloom. She closed the notebook, placed it on her lap, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she exhaled. The morning light spilled into the kitchen like a promise. It stretched long and gold across the floorboards, catching on the chipped tile and the edges of a mason jar filled with wildflowers someone, probably Cassian, had picked and forgotten. The house smelled of something warm and slightly burnt. Pancakes. Again. "I don't know how you keep screwing them up," Cassian muttered from the counter, poking at a steaming stack with a suspicious fork. Silas flipped the next one in the pan with theatrical flair. "It's a talent. From the table." Nora giggled. "Last time he made 'em," Cassian continued, "we had to use syrup as glue just to hold them together. They were fluffy." Silas defended. "They were soggy. They were interpretive." Lila, quiet as usual, didn't laugh, but she smiled. A real one. Small. Earned. Ellery sat in her wheelchair by the edge of the table, watching it unfold. Not just breakfast, but belonging. The kind that happened naturally, without someone announcing it. And she felt something unexpected. Guilt? Not because she didn't appreciate it, but because part of her wanted to stay. And she didn't deserve that. Not after all the doors she'd shut. Not after the secrets she'd kept. "Lila," she said gently, "what are you drawing?" The little girl looked up, blinking. "It's a rabbit house." Ellery leaned forward. The paper was filled with curved lines, tiny windows, a garden with carrots and clovers, and a fluffy bunny sitting at a table drinking tea. Nora peered over. "That's Mr. Tumble," she announced, pointing at the stuffed rabbit clutched under her arm. "I gave him his own chair," Lila said softly, "so he never has to feel left out." Cassian looked at Ellery, then back at the drawing. "That's a good house," he said. "Everyone's got a place." Ellery didn't say anything, but her chest ached. Later that morning, Silas and Cassian had to make a run to town supplies for the garden, a new hose nozzle, and a replacement latch for the back gate. The girls stayed behind with Ellery. She took them out back, to the sun-warmed slope behind the house, where the earth was still soft from yesterday's digging. Nora skipped ahead, chattering to herself. Lila walked beside her mother's chair, quietly humming. Ellery had brought a book, but her fingers kept closing around the spine without opening it. The sun felt too kind, the silence too alive. "Do you miss it?" Lila asked suddenly. Ellery turned. "Miss what?" "Baby before." The question was simple. The answer wasn't. "I miss some of it," Ellery said, "but not all of it." Lila nodded like she understood. "I miss being smaller. Smaller before the accident. Before you got sad all the time." The words cut deep. Not cruel. Just true. Ellery looked at her daughter, at the way she stared down at the grass. Her shoes too tight. Her cheeks freckled from sun. "I'm sorry," Ellery whispered. Lila shrugged. "You don't have to say sorry. Mom, I just wanted you to know I remember you before." The front door creaked open just before lunch. Silas stepped inside, carrying a brown paper bag under one arm and a small potted plant in the other. "Surprise," he said. "Thrift store had this on the porch out front. No tag, no price. The guy said I could take it if I promised not to kill it." He handed it to Ellery. Lavender. She inhaled deeply. It smelled like memory, like the windowsill of her old apartment, like the last time she read Neruda aloud to someone who actually listened. Her fingers brushed the edge of the clay pot. "I used to have one of these," she murmured. "Well," Silas said, "now you've got another." That night, after the girls had been tucked in and Cassian had retreated upstairs with a graphic novel and a bowl of cereal, Ellery wheeled into the sunroom and stared out at the darkened garden. The stars above Alder Creek were clearer than in the city. They weren't crowded by streetlights or traffic. They just shined. Silas came in with 2 mugs of tea, one for each of them. No questions, no expectations. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you became someone you don't recognize?" Silas didn't look surprised by the question. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "After Marla died, I kept thinking, this isn't the man she married. This isn't the dad Cassian needs." "What did you do?" "Kept showing up anyway." He sipped his tea. "Turns out that's how you find yourself again. You show up until you start recognizing who walks through the door." Ellery looked down at her lap. "I kept too many doors shut. For too long. I told myself it was protection, but it was fear. Of being seen. Of being known." He didn't interrupt. She whispered, "There are things I never told anyone. Not even the girls." Silas's voice was low, certain. "Then maybe it's time." Ellery nodded once. Not ready, but willing. And sometimes that was enough. Ellery hadn't meant to stay a week. But time passed differently in a place that didn't expect anything from you. Each day began with the sound of birds outside the sunroom and ended with a quiet knock from Silas, carrying a steaming mug of herbal tea like clockwork. It wasn't romance. It wasn't obligation. It was presence. And it was starting to unmake her. "Hey, you want to help me plant these?" Silas asked one morning, holding a paper bag filled with sunflower seeds. They stood on the back porch well. He stood. Ellery sat with the girls, a basket of gardening gloves and old jam jars beside her. "Sunflowers?" she asked. "They follow the light," he said simply. Cassian snorted from behind them. "They're weeds that pretend to be flowers." Silas grinned. "That, too." Nora eagerly tore open the packet. "I want to make them dance." "Flowers don't dance," Lila said with quiet certainty. Ellery watched her daughters argue like they used to, playfully, without the weight they'd carried lately. And then she glanced at Silas. "You do this often?" she asked. "Plant things, rescue people?" He looked over at her, expression unreadable. "Sometimes the difference between planting and rescuing is just whether you stick around to water it." She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she suddenly wanted to believe it. Later that afternoon, Cassian asked Ellery a question that caught her completely off guard. "So, what did you used to do?" They were alone in the living room. The girls were napping upstairs, Nora snoring softly. Mr. Tumble clutched like a bodyguard. Silas had gone into town for groceries. Cassian sat on the floor, sketching lazily in a notebook, headphones looped around his neck. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't prying. He just wanted to know. Ellery blinked. "I used to work in policy," she said finally. "Nonprofit sector. Housing equity. Mostly." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "Like law?" "Not quite. More like trying to make sure people didn't fall through cracks that shouldn't exist in the first place." He scribbled something. "Sounds like you were trying to fix broken things." She nodded. "Maybe too many." Cassian hesitated. "Is that what happened to your legs?" Her throat tightened. "No," she said softly. "That came later." That evening, after dinner, Ellery rolled herself into the garden. The sunflower seeds had been gently tucked into the earth, and the patch now had little handmade markers Nora's had glitter on it. Lila's was just her name and a date. She reached down and brushed dirt from one of the wooden sticks. It felt like something sacred. "You can stay," Silas said from behind her. She didn't jump. Somehow, she always felt when he was near. Not because of footsteps, because of stillness. "I mean it," he said. "This doesn't have to be temporary." Ellery looked straight ahead. Everything in my life has been temporary. Love, trust, even my legs. People always say stay until they get uncomfortable with the truth. What truth, he asked. She turned to him. That I'm not healed, that I've made mistakes, that I'm still figuring out how to be okay, and that sometimes I want to quit. Silas sat on the porch step beside her, arms resting on his knees. I'd be more worried if you didn't feel all that, Ellery chuckled bitterly. You always know the right thing to say. No, he replied. I just say what I needed to hear, back when I didn't know how to ask. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ellery sat in the kitchen with a notebook she hadn't opened in years. She used to write poetry, not for publishing, not even for anyone to read, just to keep her head clear, to bleed in a way that didn't leave stains. She opened it now and flipped to a blank page. The pen in her hand trembled, but she wrote anyway. They called it a fall, but it felt like waking, like gravity saying, you don't need to hold it all alone. Her handwriting was shaky, but her heart was steady. 2 days later, she got a letter in the mail. It was from her sister, someone she hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years, someone who knew exactly who Ellery was and what she'd walked away from. The handwriting on the envelope was tight, impersonal. It had been forwarded twice. Somehow, it found its way here. Silas handed it to her silently, and she stared at it for hours before finally tearing it open. The letter was brief. Dad's company is in transition. There's talk of someone looking for his heir. You left a lot behind when you vanished. I don't know what you're planning, but if you care about Lila's future, maybe you should come back before someone else writes her out. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Ellery folded the letter carefully. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her thoughts did. She had worked for years in her father's foundation, even helped build its community division. She never told Silas, or Cassian, or even her girls. But the truth was simple and staggering. Lila wasn't just hers. She was the named heir of $1 billion trust. It arrived quietly. No courier, no knock on the door, just the soft flap of the mailbox and the sound of Cassian's boots across the gravel. He'd gone out for the feed catalog Silas was expecting. Instead, he came back holding a pale blue envelope, heavy paper, gold-trimmed edges, sealed with wax. He set it on the kitchen table like it might explode. Ellery stared at it from across the room. She knew that seal. Ash and gold, Boston, estate law. Her breath caught in her throat. Something you want to explain, Silas asked gently. She didn't answer. Not yet. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep and Cassian was upstairs doing his nightly battle with algebra, Ellery sat in the sunroom. The envelope sat untouched on the table in front of her, like a ghost she'd invited back. Silas pulled up a chair and waited. When she finally opened it, her hands didn't shake, but her voice did. She read aloud, to Ms. Ellery Voss, I represent the estate of Richard Ashford, recently deceased. A provision in his will references a minor Lila Voss believed to be his biological child. Per Mr. Ashford's request, we seek confirmation of paternity. Should this be verified, the minor would be named sole heir to the Ashford Legacy Trust and beneficiary of the Weston Foundation holdings. Kindly respond within 10 business days to coordinate preliminary documentation. Henry D. Keene, Soar, Ash and Gold Law. Boston. The letter dropped to her lap. Silas said nothing at first. His face didn't register surprise, only clarity, like pieces had just fallen into place. Ellery stared out the window. I never told him. Silas didn't move. Richard. She nodded. We were young, met at a literature symposium in Vermont. He was intense, idealistic, the kind of man who quoted Neruda and believed it mattered. What happened, I got scared. She said, he wasn't wealthy then, just brilliant. We had one summer, then I left for law school, met someone safer, married quickly, tried to make it all disappear. Silas leaned forward slightly. And Lila? She's his, Ellery whispered. She has his eyes, his quiet. Does she know? No. She thinks he was just someone I knew once. I never said more. Silas ran a hand over his jaw. What made you leave everything? Ellery swallowed hard. My father. When I told him I was pregnant and unmarried, he made me feel like I'd failed at existing. So I married someone that made the shame look respectable. But it didn't last. And when the accident happened, she looked down at her legs. I lost everything. Not just my body, my job, my dignity, my place in the world. Silas's voice was low. But you didn't lose your girls. She looked up at him. No, and that's why I kept them far from that legacy. I didn't want them to be owned by it. The next morning, Silas found her in the garden. The girls were inside drawing with Cassian. Nora had discovered glitter glue, which now coated half the dining table. Ellery was alone, her hands buried in the soil, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Silas crouched next to her. They reached out for a reason, he said quietly. They want to take her. She replied, not looking at him. Maybe. Or maybe they want to know her. Same thing. Silas didn't argue. I don't want to lose her, she admitted. And I don't know if telling her the truth is an act of love or betrayal. It's both, he said. Ellery turned to him. Tell me what to do. He shook his head. I can't, but I'll sit with you while you decide. That afternoon, Ellery sat with Lila under the porch. Nora was nearby, trying to convince Mr. Tumble that lemonade was good for bunnies. Lila was reading silently, a poetry book, one of the few Ellery had brought with her. Ellery watched her daughter's lips move with the rhythm of lines. I want to tell you a story, Ellery said softly. Lila closed the book and waited. A long time ago, I met someone. Ellery began. He was kind, curious. He made me believe the world was full of beautiful things, even the broken ones. Lila didn't speak, but her eyes didn't waver. We weren't together for long, but from that time came something unexpected. You! Lila's fingers curled slightly around the book cover. He didn't know. Ellery said, I never told him. Why, Lila asked. I was afraid. Ellery admitted that I'd ruin his life, that he'd want to change yours, that he'd take you away. Did he want me? Ellery looked away. I don't know. There was silence, just the hum of bees in the lavender and the creak of the old swing in the wind. Then Lila said, But you did. Ellery blinked. Lila reached out and took her hand. That's enough. That night, Ellery sat by the fire with Silas. She held the letter again. Reread it, folded it. I'll write them back, she said. Good, but I won't give her up. Silas nodded. Then we fight. A beat passed. Will you help me? He didn't hesitate. Always. The letter sat unopened on the mantel for 2 days after Ellery's reply had been mailed. Not untouched, just unread. She passed it each time she wheeled through the living room. Sometimes she paused, ran her fingers along the edge of the envelope. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried not just paper, but judgment. She kept hearing her own voice, over and over. I never told him, not even in the end. Not when Richard Ashford's name appeared on every news banner in the country. Not when the obituary ran in the Atlantic. Not when she saw his smile older, sharper, but still the same on a magazine cover months after his death. She'd written the letter, once, 7 years ago, folded it carefully, placed it in a journal, never mailed it. That, she thought now, might have been the cruelest choice of all. That evening, the sky hung low with the weight of an incoming storm. Cassian was upstairs playing music quietly from his room. Nora had fallen asleep curled into a quilt on the floor, one arm around Mr. Tumble. Lila was sitting on the steps outside the sunroom, sketchbook in her lap, pencil in hand, her brow furrowed, mouth pulled to one side in concentration. Ellery watched her from the doorway for a long time before wheeling outside. The boards creaked beneath her. "You drawing again?" she asked. Lila nodded. "The garden. Can I see?" Lila hesitated, then turned the sketch pad. There it was, the rows of dark earth, tiny shoots pushing upward, the little wooden name sign staked into the soil. But this time, there were people. Cassian crouched by a row of beans, Nora running with muddy boots, Silas holding a shovel, and Ellery centered, smiling, sun on her face. "You didn't forget anyone," Ellery whispered. "No," Lila said, "because it's home." Ellery swallowed. There was so much she wanted to say, so many versions of the truth she'd carried, shaped, hidden. She thought of her father, the real one, the one who had always made her feel like she was one misstep away from being disowned. She thought of her ex-husband, who married her for order, not love. She thought of Richard, who had once read poetry with her in a cabin in Vermont and asked what it would take for her to stay. And she thought of what it meant to lie by omission, to protect her child, yes, but also to protect her own shame. That night, she opened the old box from the back of the closet. She hadn't touched it in years. Inside were remnants of the life she'd tried to forget. A worn program from the Vermont Symposium. A faded photograph of her and Richard him, mid-laugh. Her hair caught in the wind. A sonogram printout labeled Voss, 9 weeks. And finally, the letter. She unfolded it carefully. The ink had bled in spots. It was written in her handwriting, tight, controlled. A letter to a man she'd never stopped caring, even after the world forgot him. "Richard, you once told me you were waiting for a reason to stop moving. I have one now. She has your eyes. Her name is Lila. I didn't tell you before. I wasn't brave enough. I thought I was protecting her, but I think I was just scared you'd love her more than me. Or worse, that you wouldn't love either of us at all. If you ever want to know her, she's here, and she's good, and she's yours." The tears came quietly. Silas found her still holding the letter, sitting by the fire, the light dancing across her face. He didn't ask what it was. She handed it to him. He read it slowly, reverently, like it deserved silence. When he finished, he looked at her, not with pity, not with disappointment, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. "I think," he said softly, "he would have come." Ellery looked down at her lap. "It doesn't matter now." "It does," Silas replied. "Not for him, but for you, and for her." The next morning, the storm broke early. Rain lashed against the windows. The orchard shimmered under silver skies. The girls stayed inside, building pillow forts and reading by flashlight, even though the power hadn't gone out. Ellery brewed tea. She watched Silas tighten a window latch and thought about all the doors he'd kept open for her quietly, without ceremony. He hadn't asked for details. He'd just given her space to tell them. "Do you think I did the right thing?" she asked. Silas didn't look up. "You mean by staying quiet?" She nodded. He finished the latch and turned toward her. "I think you did what you could with the fear you had." Ellery's eyes shimmered. "Do you think she'll hate me when she's older?" "No," Silas said. "But I think she'll ask questions, and I think you'll have to answer them. With truth, not shame." Ellery exhaled. That was the difference. She wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. She was afraid of the cost. Later that day, she watched as Nora taught Mr. Tumble how to dance in a tutu made from rubber bands. Cassian rolled his eyes but didn't leave the room. Lila curled next to her mom on the couch and whispered, "You seem lighter today." Ellery kissed her forehead. "Maybe I am. It began, as many storms do, with something that looked small. A knock at the door, too firm, too exact, not a neighbor, not a friend." Silas wiped his hands on a towel and opened it. The man on the porch stood like someone used to taking space without asking for it. Pressed charcoal suit, clean-shaven, leather briefcase, slick and smooth and sterile. "Mr. Trent," the man asked. "That's me. I'm Corbin Yates, legal representative of Ash and Gold Law, Boston. I believe you're expecting a response." Silas didn't move. From the kitchen, Ellery appeared wheeling forward, calm but stiff. "I'm Ellery Voss." Yates turned to her. Offering a hand he quickly realized she wouldn't take. "May I come in?" "No, Marsh," she said evenly. "We can talk here." Yates blinked, adjusted his tie. "Very well." He opened the briefcase on the porch rail, produced a manila folder, and clicked a pen. "Ms. Voss, pursuant to the sealed provision of Richard Ashford's last will and testament, and per the response received, we are initiating preliminary steps toward guardianship reassignment for the minor known as Lila Voss." Ellery's voice didn't waver. "What does that mean?" "It means," Yates said, "if paternity is confirmed, which we fully expect, Lila becomes legal heir to the Weston Foundation Legacy Trust, valued conservatively at $34 million. Our firm, in partnership with the Ashford Estate Trustees, will then recommend custodial transition to a court-appointed guardian in Boston, under oversight of the Foundation Board." The porch went very still. Cassian, watching from inside the screen door, muttered something under his breath. Silas narrowed his eyes. "You mean to take her away?" Yates blinked. "Not take. Relocate. We're offering opportunity, security, legacy." Ellery's tone turned steel cold. "She has security. She has love. She has a bedtime story and a garden with her name on it. She doesn't need a new zip code to validate her worth." Yates didn't flinch. "You are not the legal widow of Mr. Ashford. There is no documented acknowledgement of the child prior to his death. Given the size of the trust, the board must act in what it deems best for the estate's future. That includes protecting the reputation and well-being of the named heir." Ellery stared at him. Then she said, slowly, "She's not a reputation. She's my daughter." When Yates left, he did so with a nod and a thin warning. "We expect your cooperation. We have the resources to pursue this fully." Silas didn't watch him go. He turned to Ellery. "You okay?" "No," she said. "But I will be." That night, the kitchen was silent. Nora sensed something was wrong and clung to Mr. Tumble with wide eyes. Lila didn't ask questions. She just sat at the table, back straight, sketching in her notebook. Cassian stood by the sink, arms crossed. "What do we do now?" "We get a lawyer," Silas said, "and we fight." Ellery nodded, but her hands trembled slightly on the table. "I never wanted her to live in someone's shadow," she whispered. "Not even his. Now they want to make her legacy their property." Cassian looked at her. "She's not a legacy," he said. "She's Lila, and she's already home." 2 days later, Ellery sat in the sunroom with the girls while Silas made calls. Most local attorneys wouldn't touch a case this complex, but eventually, through a friend of a friend, they found one Maya Hollis, a family law specialist based 2 towns over. Small practice, but tenacious reputation. They scheduled a consult. Ellery dressed carefully, navy blazer, clean jeans, hair pulled back. It was the first time in months she'd looked in a mirror and thought, "You look like someone worth listening to." When they arrived, Maya greeted them with a warm smile and zero condescension. "I read the estate papers," Maya said after introductions. "They're trying to intimidate you. It's leverage, not law." Ellery's voice was steady. "They want her in Boston. They want control," Maya corrected. "Your daughter is more valuable as a figurehead than a child to them." "Can we stop them?" Silas asked. Maya leaned back in her chair. "Yes, but it won't be clean, and it won't be fast. You'll be scrutinized, cross-examined. Lila's name will be in papers and documents, and maybe if they push hard enough, public records." Ellery looked down at her lap. "She doesn't even know what a trust is," she murmured. "She just wants to grow carrots." Maya nodded. "Then let's make sure she still can." Back at the house, Ellery wheeled into the garden just before sunset. The soil was dark from a light rain. The rows were clean, shoots reaching. Lila sat nearby, drawing again. This time, she handed her sketch to her mother without waiting to be asked. It was a tree, roots deep, branches full of leaves. At the base, her mom's wheelchair. Next to it, Mr. Tumble. Above a banner, "This is our family." Ellery pressed the paper to her chest. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. The subpoena came on a Thursday, cream envelope, heavy ink, signed by a probate court judge in Massachusetts. Silas found it stuffed into their rural mailbox, folded and damp from the morning fog. The ink was smudged, but the message was clear. "You are hereby summoned to appear regarding the custody and financial guardianship of the minor Lila Voss in relation to the Ashford estate." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war. That evening, Ellery sat in her room, staring at the folder Maya had handed her. Inside legal documents, court timelines, and most terrifying of all, a family history chart. A document built by strangers who didn't know her child, who didn't know her. They saw assets and paternity, but not the scraped knees, not the whispered lullabies, not the nights she'd stayed awake counting breaths after the accident, not the motherhood. Silas knocked gently and stepped in. He didn't say anything, just placed a mug of chamomile on her nightstand and stood there until she looked up. "Do you think I'm being selfish?" Ellery asked softly. "No," he said. "I think you're being brave. But maybe she'd have more, if I let them." Silas crouched down beside her chair. "She already has more, because she has you." She looked at him, then really looked. This man who had taken them in without knowing who they were, or where they'd come from, who had fixed her daughter's crutches without asking how they broke, who had taught them how to grow things again. "I'm scared," she whispered. He reached for her hand. Then let's be scared together. Over the next week, Maya began building their case. Ellery supplied every document. She had birth certificates, school records, journals, letters. She testified to her own trauma, her marriage, her estrangement from her parents, her years of nonprofit work, her silence. Cassian testified too, writing a letter Maya would submit as character evidence. It was only 2 paragraphs, written in the kind of blunt, honest voice only a 17-year-old could get away with. I didn't like Ellery at first, but I think that's because I didn't understand the kind of pain she carries. Now I see her for what she is, someone who's been crushed, but not broken. And if you want proof of her goodness, look at her kids. That's who raised them. Silas signed on as legal support, not family by blood, but witness to love. They were building not just a defense, they were building truth. The day before they were set to leave for Boston, Ellery walked the orchard path alone. It wasn't far, but it took longer now. Her arms tired faster than they used to, but still, she pushed forward until she reached the far tree, the one Lila had drawn. She stopped there, sat still, closed her eyes, and for the first time, she prayed, not for victory, but for clarity, that when she sat in front of strangers, she would remember who she was. Not Richard's past, not the Voss family shame, just a mother, a woman, a voice. That night, Lila tiptoed into her mother's room. She held a new drawing. This time it was a courtroom, but not the kind they show on TV. There were flowers on the windowsill, a rabbit in the front row, Silas holding Nora, Cassian sitting tall, Maya at a desk, and in the center Ellery, standing, no wheelchair, just tall, present, brave. I drew this, Lila said. How I see you, how you always feel to me, even when you think you're small. Ellery's breath caught. She pulled her daughter close, pressed her forehead to Lila's hair. I'm going to fight for you, she whispered. I know, Layla replied, but I'll fight too. The next morning, they loaded into Silas's old truck. Cassian rode up front beside his dad. Maya followed in her car. Ellery and the girls were bundled in the back, books and snacks in hand. It wasn't just a trip. It was a reckoning. As they drove, Ellery watched the trees blur past and felt something uncoil in her chest. For years, she had lived like someone waiting to be called unworthy. Now, she was going to answer the call, not with apologies, but with proof of love. They arrived in Boston as the sky turned to soft gold. The city buzzed too fast, too crowded, too loud compared to the quiet rhythm of Alder Creek. But inside the courtroom, everything paused. Silence hung like tension in the air. Yates sat at the estate's table, flanked by a team of black-suited advisors. He didn't look at Ellery as she wheeled in, but he knew she was there. Maya whispered, You ready? Ellery looked down at her lap, then at her daughters, Nora with paint on her sleeve, Lila with her rabbit tucked beside her. I'm ready, she said. The courtroom was colder than Ellery expected, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Too sterile, too clean, like no one had ever cried here, like no child had ever laughed in these walls. She wheeled to her seat beside Maya. Lila sat behind her with Silas and Nora. Cassian had insisted on coming too, even though no one had asked him to. At the front, the judge gray-haired, thin-framed, sharp-eyed Justice Evelyn Morrow. Not cruel, but not the type to be swayed by sentiment. This wasn't a place for storybooks, but Ellery knew it was her story that mattered now. Yates stood first, his tone all polish and procedure. He cited the will, the legacy, the millions set aside in trust. He noted that Richard Ashford had no formal acknowledgement of paternity. He referred to Lila not by name, but as the minor. He used words like intergenerational stewardship, institutional reputation, asset security. Ellery sat still, because in that moment, she realized something. They weren't fighting for Lila. They were fighting for what she represented. Then it was Maya's turn. She stood, calm and clear, and began laying out the timeline Ellery's work history. The absence of any abuse or neglect, the consistent schooling of both girls, letters from teachers, neighbors, even the local pastor. Cashin's testimony, read aloud. Then she said quietly, "And now, Your Honor, Ms. Voss would like to speak." Ellery wheeled herself forward. The room felt like it was holding its breath. She took one long moment to gather her voice, not to be dramatic, but to be honest. "I won't pretend I'm perfect," she began. "I won't pretend I didn't make mistakes. I have—" Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles pale. "I walked away from a family that made me feel small. I married someone who didn't love my girls. I kept secrets because I thought they'd protect the people I loved." She paused. "But if motherhood has taught me anything, it's that love doesn't come from perfection. It comes from showing up anyway." She turned slightly toward the back of the room, where Lila was sitting with her sketchbook folded in her lap. "My daughter doesn't need a foundation. She needs a garden. She needs a father figure who taught her to hang a swing. She needs a brother who reads to her when the lights go out. She needs her sister's laughter, and she needs me." Ellery looked back at the judge. "She needs the life we've built, not the one strangers are now trying to buy her into." The courtroom was still. Even Yates didn't speak. After a pause, Maya called Silas to the stand. He took the oath, hand steady, gaze unwavering. "What is your relationship to Ms.?" Voss Maya asked. He smiled faintly. "Depends on who you ask." A few people chuckled. Even the judge allowed a small tilt of her head. "But to me," Silas continued, "she's the strongest person I've ever known. And to my son, she's the one who made our house feel like a home again. And to Lila," Silas's eyes softened, "she's her anchor, and she's her wings." Next was the moment Ellery dreaded most. Lila was asked to testify. Maya had prepared her for this, gently, but it still felt like too much for a 10-year-old girl. And yet, when Lila stepped up, she did not tremble. She climbed onto the small wooden stool, legs too short to reach the floor. She held Mr. Tumble in one hand, and when asked to speak, she did so softly but clearly. "Do you know why you're here today?" the judge asked gently. Lila nodded. "To see if I should go live somewhere else. And what do you think about that I don't want to? Why not? Because I'm already where I belong." The judge raised a brow. "Can you tell me why you feel that?" Lila thought for a moment, then said, "Because home isn't made of money. It's made of people who see you." A silence rippled through the room. Then the judge said, "Thank you. Lila, you can go back to your seat." Court recessed for the day. The final decision wouldn't come until the morning. As they left the courtroom, Ellery felt drained, like she'd left pieces of herself on the floor. In the hotel room that night, the family didn't talk much. Silas made grilled cheese in the tiny kitchenette. Cassian watched something on mute. Nora fell asleep with her shoes still on, and Lila curled up next to her mother, holding a drawing. This one was different. No garden, no courtroom, just a bridge, with her on one side and Ellery on the other. Underneath, in Lila's handwriting, "You carried me across, Ellery didn't sleep. None of them really did. The hotel was too quiet, the air too dry, and the weight of unspoken hope too heavy. She sat by the window while the others dozed restlessly. Outside, the Boston skyline glittered under a curtain of pre-dawn fog. She could see the courthouse from here, just a block away, but it might as well have been another universe. The courthouse where her daughter's future now sat in a manila folder. Silas stirred on the couch. Cassian tossed in his fold-out bed. Nora mumbled something about pancakes in her sleep. Lila, curled next to Ellery, blinked up at her. "Are we going home tomorrow?" she whispered. Ellery didn't answer right away. Then she leaned down, kissed her forehead, and said, "One way or another. We will, by 8:30, They were back in the same courtroom, same judge, same legal team. But something felt different. The air had shifted. The tension had softened. Even Yates looked smaller. Not defeated. Exactly. Just less certain. Justice Morrow sat behind the bench, fingers folded, eyes calm but firm. She didn't waste time. "I've reviewed the estate documents, the paternity implications, and most importantly, the living conditions and emotional testimony presented." Yates sat up straighter. "I recognize the concern the Ashford trustees have raised: legacy stewardship, public narrative, and fiscal oversight. But I must remind the court that guardianship is not determined by net worth, but by human worth." Maya's shoulders eased slightly. The judge turned to Ellery. "Miss Voss," she said, "your testimony was deeply personal. Your record shows no neglect, no legal red flags, and no indication that Lila has ever lacked for love or support." She paused. "However, I also believe children should not be hidden from their truth. Silence, even protective silence, has its consequences." Ellery nodded slowly. "I understand." The judge glanced at the paperwork in front of her. "In light of all presented, I am ruling the following, Ms. Ellery Voss will retain full legal and physical custody of Lila Voss. However, in the spirit of legacy transparency, a quarterly family liaison, non-invasive, non-disruptive, will be assigned to maintain optional contact between Lila and the Ashford estate." A beat passed. "Should Ms. Voss wish to accept any portion of the Weston Trust on behalf of her daughter in future, she may initiate proceedings under the estate's secondary clause, allowing Lila to access funds upon legal adulthood or verified educational need." Ellery exhaled, a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Court is adjourned." Outside, the morning air hit like baptism. Maya hugged her tight, brief, and without words. Cassian gave her a rare high five. Nora spun in circles until she was dizzy, and Lila stood beside her, holding Ellery's hand. She said nothing at first. "Then I don't want the money." Ellery knelt down. "You don't have to take it." Lila frowned. "I just want my carrots to grow, and to stay with you. That's enough." Ellery smiled, tears welling. "It's more than enough. Baby." They drove back to Alder Creek through the long back roads past golden fields and empty gas stations, past sleepy diners and wildflower fences. By the time they turned onto the gravel drive of the Trent house, the sun had begun to set. Home looked the same, and yet everything had changed. That night, they sat on the porch eating leftover pie and watching the stars. The wind was warm. The swing creaked gently. Fireflies blinked along the hedges. Ellery looked at Silas. "You never asked me to stay." He sipped his coffee, eyes on the orchard. "I figured you already knew the door was open." She reached for his hand. "It's more than that now." He nodded. squeezing her fingers. Yeah, I know. Later, as the others slept. Ellery returned to the garden. She moved row by row, checking for sprouts. At the far edge, a sunflower shoot had begun to stretch tiny, strong, reaching toward the moonlight. She sat there for a while, then pulled out her notebook and wrote, "The courtroom did not save us. The soil did. The firewood. The late-night stories. The quiet hands that never let go. They fought for her inheritance. But we gave her something more. A life where she can belong, not because of who her father was, but because of who she is." Late summer came quietly to Alder Creek, the kind of days where light melted into the fields like honey, where the air was thick with the scent of ripe apples and drying lavender, where no one rushed, where the past didn't echo, it softened. The legal storm had passed, and life didn't resume. It restarted. Not where they left off, but somewhere deeper. The orchard had bloomed with a kind of generosity Ellery hadn't expected. Every tree, even the one that had nearly died in the spring frost, bore fruit. Red, gold, speckled green. Lila ran through the rows barefoot. Nora chased after her, Mr. Tumble bouncing in one arm. Cassian had taken to carving small wooden animals in the tool shed, whittling in the late afternoons with a radio on low. And Silas, he'd built a new swing from cedar and hung it on the oldest tree. 2 ropes, 2 seats, side by side, one for the girls, the other, perhaps, for someone still learning how to sit still. Ellery had started writing again, not just letters, not journal entries, but chapters, about gardens and grief, about truth and trembling, about what it meant to be invisible in the eyes of power and seen in the heart of a child. She didn't know if she'd ever publish. That wasn't the point. Each page was a reclamation, each sentence a seed. One Sunday morning, Silas found her under the pear tree. She was reading, feet tucked beneath her, hair tied in a loose braid. The wheelchair was parked nearby, unused. He sat beside her on the blanket. "You've been quiet lately," he said. She nodded. "I think, for the first time in a long time, my mind isn't shouting." He smiled. "That's a good thing." She looked over at him. "You still okay with all of this? The kids, the chaos, the compost bins I keep forgetting to close?" Silas shrugged. "I didn't sign up for perfect. I signed up for real." Ellery tilted her head. "And me, you," he said, "were never a question." That afternoon, they hosted a small harvest picnic. Neighbors brought peach pies. The kids picked sunflowers and tied them into crowns. Lila led a tour of the garden she and Nora had helped plant, pausing proudly at the row of carrots, then holding up her sketchbook for proof. Cassian grilled burgers. Silas played guitar under the awning. Ellery sat with Maya, who had come for the weekend. They shared iced tea and stories, legal ones, personal ones. "I've been thinking," Maya said, "about launching a foundation for women who've been through what you have, or worse." Ellery raised a brow. "You want me to write the mission statement?" Maya smirked. "I want you to lead it." Ellery laughed, but it caught in her throat. Not fear, not doubt, just the awe of being seen in a new way again. That night, long after the picnic had ended and the fireflies blinked lazily in the hedgerow, Lila came out to the porch. Ellery was there. So was Silas. Lila held out a folded paper. "It's not a drawing this time," she said. "It's a story, just a short one." Ellery opened it. Once there was a girl who had 2 mothers, one who carried her in her body, one who carried her in her stories. But they were the same woman. She had a garden heart, a mountain spine, and a voice like fire and rain at once. And that girl. She grew up full, not because she had everything, but because someone stayed. Ellery's vision blurred. Lila looked up. I know it was hard. Mom. Ellery knelt, her legs unsteady but her arms sure. I'd do it all again, she said. Every bruise, every court date, every breath. Lila smiled. I know. Later, as stars spread above the orchard, Ellery and Silas sat side by side in the cedar swing. She rested her head on his shoulder. You ever think about what would have happened if we never stopped for gas that day, she asked. He chuckled. I do. And I'd still be that guy with a broken fence and no damn clue what he was missing. Ellery smiled, and the swing creaked gently, like an old heartbeat learning a new rhythm. Autumn settled into Alder Creek like a story that had finally exhaled. The trees turned flame and gold. The orchard slowed its breathing. And life, at last, found its rhythm again, not perfect, but rooted, not quiet, but true. Lanterns hung from the porch rafters, now small. Hand-painted ones Lila and Nora had made out of old jam jars. Each one different, each one glowing at dusk. People started calling the house Lantern Haven, not because someone put up a sign, but because word spread. There was a place at the end of a gravel road where you could start over. Even if the world had told you there was no space left. One weekend in October, Ellery held her first workshop in the barn. A handful of women, a stack of blank notebooks, a whiteboard that read, "What's your story?" if no one could silence it. They shared in a circle. Stories of escape, of shame turned into scaffolding, of children saved, of futures reclaimed. Ellery didn't give them advice. She gave them space, and somehow, that was more than enough. Silas continued fixing everything and nothing. A new roof for the greenhouse, repaired fencing, Cassian's college application essays, which he read out loud with dramatic flair while Nora tried to teach Mr. Tumble how to play dead. One night, as they tucked the girls into bed, Lila asked, Do I have to go to Boston one day? You'll go, Ellery said gently, if you choose to, not because they choose it for you. And if I don't want to take their money? Silas smiled. Then you'll grow something better. The orchard bore its last fruit in mid-November. Ellery stood beneath the big oak with her daughters and Cassian, baskets full of late pears and wind-fallen apples. They laughed when Nora slipped in the mud and pulled Lila down with her. Silas just shook his head, smiled, and helped them up mud, joy and all. The sun cut low across the field, and for a moment, everything was still. That night, Ellery lit the last of the lanterns. She sat on the porch with her notebook, writing by hand. They never asked for much, just a place to land. A man with calloused hands, a boy with eyes like quiet thunder, two girls who healed in play, a rabbit who refused to be tamed, and a woman who came undone, only to discover that wholeness was never the absence of pain, but the presence of love that stayed. She closed the book, looked at the sky, then smiled, because the stars were no longer just above her. They were with her. Months passed. Ellery published a book, quietly, independently, titled Lantern Haven, What Grows After the Breaking. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the people it needed to. And one day, Lila came home from school carrying an essay she had written. My mother didn't win a war. She grew a garden. She didn't break rules. She rewrote them. And when the world said, You don't belong, she built a swing and invited others to sit. Cassian went to college in the city, came home every other weekend with laundry, questions, and poetry he was too shy to share. Nora kept Mr. Tumble into high school, started a podcast called Carrots and Chaos. Lila. She stayed close to the soil, became a quiet leader. Her sketches became murals. And when she was old enough, she chose to take only a fraction of the Ashford Fund, just enough to seed something new. A grant for single mothers rebuilding after loss. She called it the Lantern Fund. And Silas and Ellery. They married under the big oak. No white gown, no aisles, just wildflowers and bare feet. And the kind of vows that come not from promises, but from proven presence. On that night, Lila lit a lantern with her little sister and hung it on the porch rail. And as dusk folded over Alder Creek, they watched it flicker gently soft, persistent, unmovable, just like the love that made this story possible. Not every story ends with a gavel or goodbye. Some stories leave lanterns behind glowing reminders that belonging isn't bought, it's built. Ellery wasn't a woman who lost everything. She was a woman who found something deeper, a life not defined by money, legacy, or last names, but by the people who stayed when the world said they shouldn't. Lila didn't need to become an heiress to matter. She already mattered. And maybe that's the message we all need to hear. That strength doesn't always roar it, sometimes whispers through quiet choices. That families aren't born, they're chosen. And that disability, poverty, or difference should never be a reason to discard someone. Because some people weren't cast out by the world. They were cast aside. And yet, they still grew. They still loved. They still shined. If this story moved you, please tap, like, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more real, powerful stories that challenge how we see the world and how we see each other. Until next time, let your lights stay on.